The taste of almonds lingered on my tongue as darkness crept around the edges of my vision. But it wasn't the bitter sweetness that made my blood run cold. It was the satisfied smile on my husband's face as he watched me fall. 7 years of marriage had taught me to recognize that particular expression. The same look he wore when he'd accidentally pushed me down the stairs last winter. The same twisted satisfaction that crossed his features when he'd locked me in the basement for 3 days, telling our neighbors I'd gone to visit my sick mother. But tonight, as my 5-year-old daughter Liliana slumped forward in her chair beside me, her small hand going limp around her fork, I realized with crystal clarity that Vincent had finally crossed a line from which there would be no return. The dining room spun around me like a carnival ride gone wrong. The crystal chandelier that had once symbolized our perfect life now cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock my naivety. How many times had I sat at this very table, making excuses for the bruises hidden beneath my sleeves? How many nights had I convinced myself that his apologies were genuine, that the flowers and jewelry that followed his rages meant he truly loved us? My body felt heavy, limbs turning to lead as whatever Vincent had laced our dinner with coursed through my veins. But my mind remained sharp, crystalline with the kind of clarity that only comes when you're staring death in the face. Through my half-closed eyelids, I watched my husband of 7 years check his watch with the casual indifference of someone waiting for a bus. Liliana's breathing had grown shallow beside me. My baby girl, who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings, who drew pictures of our family with bright crayons and hung them on the refrigerator with magnetic letters that spelled love. The same child who had started flinching whenever Vincent raised his voice, who had begun wetting the bed again after witnessing one of his episodes. The floor felt cold against my cheek as I slumped from my chair, my body betraying me even as my mind raced. Vincent's polished dress shoes came into view, the same ones he'd worn to our wedding, the same ones that had kicked me in the ribs just last month when I dared to question why he'd been coming home so late. This was it. This was how it would end. Not with the dramatic escape I'd fantasized about during those long sleepless nights when the pain was too much to bear. Not with the courage I'd promised myself I'd find someday. But here in our dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a life I'd fought so hard to preserve. Vincent's footsteps echoed across the room as he moved toward the kitchen, probably to dispose of whatever evidence remained of his carefully planned evening. The sound grew distant, and in that moment of solitude something inside me shifted. The fear that had been my constant companion for years began to transform into something else entirely. Something darker, more dangerous. Because Vincent had made one crucial mistake. In his arrogance, in his absolute certainty that he had won, he had underestimated the woman he'd spent years trying to break. He had forgotten that beneath the bruises and the tears, beneath the carefully constructed facade of the perfect wife, lived someone who had once been strong enough to survive her own childhood trauma. Someone who had clawed her way out of poverty to build a life worth living. As consciousness slipped away from me like water through cupped hands, one thought burned bright in the gathering darkness. If I survived this night, Vincent would learn that there are fates far worse than death. And I would be the one to teach him. Before we continue, please write in the comment which country you are watching this video. We love knowing where our global family is tuning in from. And if this is your first time on this channel, please subscribe. Your support helps us bring even more epic revenge tales of life. Enjoy listening. The morning had started like any other day in our pristine suburban home. Vincent left for his job at the investment firm at exactly 7:30 a.m., his kiss on my cheek as perfunctory as his daily inspection of my appearance. "Make sure Liliana's ready for school," he'd said, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. "And remember, we're having dinner together tonight. As a family." The emphasis on those last 3 words sent a familiar chill down my spine. Family dinners in the Landon household weren't the warm, chaotic affairs I remembered from my childhood. They were performances, carefully orchestrated events where every word was measured, every gesture scrutinized. I spent the day in my usual routine, dropping Liliana at Riverside Elementary, grocery shopping after work at the market where the cashiers knew me by name but never asked about the concealer that couldn't quite hide the fading bruise on my jaw, picking up Vincent's dry cleaning, preparing for another evening of walking on eggshells. Liliana bounded through the front door at 3:15 p.m., her backpack bouncing against her small frame. At 5 years old, she was all energy and curiosity, with Vincent's dark hair and my green eyes. She was the one pure thing in our complicated world, the reason I'd stayed long past the point when any rational person would have left. "Mommy, look what I made." She thrust a construction paper card toward me, decorated with glitter and crooked hearts. "It's for you and Daddy." My throat tightened as I read her careful kindergarten handwriting. "I love my family." The innocence in her voice, the genuine joy in her expression. It was everything I was fighting to protect, everything Vincent's darkness threatened to destroy. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I managed, pulling her into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Why don't you go wash your hands while I start dinner?" The kitchen had always been my sanctuary, the one place where Vincent rarely intruded. As I moved through the familiar motions of preparing our meal, seasoning the chicken, chopping vegetables, setting the table with our wedding china, I tried to push away the growing sense of unease that had been building all day. Vincent had been different lately. Quieter. More calculating. The explosive rages that had defined our marriage for years had given way to something colder, more methodical. He watched me now with the patience of a predator, as if he were waiting for something. The front door opened at exactly 6 p.m. Vincent's punctuality was legendary, another tool in his arsenal of control. I heard him hang his coat in the closet, place his briefcase by the stairs, wash his hands in the powder room. The same routine every single day. "Something smells wonderful," he said as he entered the kitchen, his voice carrying that false warmth he reserved for public consumption. He kissed my cheek again, his hand lingering on my waist in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to an outside observer but felt like a claim of ownership. "Chicken marsala," I replied, keeping my voice light. "Your favorite." "Let me help you with that," he'd said. I was surprised how he offered to help in the chicken, telling me to go help Liliana upstairs while he finished up. And for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. The charming, successful businessman who had swept me off my feet with grand gestures and passionate declarations of love. That man had been a carefully constructed lie, but Liliana didn't know that. To her, Vincent was still the daddy who brought her presents and read her bedtime stories when he was in a good mood. She hadn't yet learned to read the subtle signs that preceded his darker moments. The tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when things didn't go according to his plan. Dinner conversation flowed with practiced ease. Vincent asked about Liliana's day at school, praised my cooking, shared carefully edited stories from his office. To anyone watching through our dining room window, we would have looked like the perfect American family: successful husband, devoted wife, adorable daughter. But I noticed things others might miss. The way Vincent's eyes never quite met mine. The slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his wine glass. The fact that he barely touched his food while encouraging Liliana and me to eat more. "This is delicious, honey," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "You've really outdone yourself tonight." I took another bite of the chicken, and that's when I tasted it. The subtle bitterness beneath the rich marsala sauce. My blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over me like a wave. The almond taste that didn't belong. The way Vincent kept checking his watch. The reason he'd insisted on cooking the sauce himself while I was upstairs helping Liliana with her homework. My fork clattered to my plate as the room began to spin. Across the table, Liliana's face had gone pale, her small hand pressed to her stomach. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice thick and confused. "I don't feel good." Vincent leaned back in his chair, that satisfied smile spreading across his face like spilled wine. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said to Liliana, his voice gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. "It'll all be over soon." The world tilted sideways as I slumped forward, my body no longer responding to my commands. But my mind was crystal clear, recording every detail with the sharp focus of someone who finally understood the true nature of their situation. As darkness closed in around me, I heard Vincent's chair scrape against the hardwood floor. His footsteps moved around the table, and I felt his presence beside me like a cold shadow. "It's done," he whispered, his voice carrying a satisfaction I'd never heard before. "They'll both be gone soon." The words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to remain still, to let my body go completely limp. Through my barely open eyelids, I watched Vincent check Liliana's pulse, then mine. Satisfied with what he found, he straightened his tie and walked toward the kitchen. In the silence that followed, I turned my head just enough to see Liliana's face. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Moving my lips as little as possible, I whispered the words that would save both our lives. Don't move yet. Because in that moment, as I lay on our dining room floor with whatever substance Vincent had used coursing through my veins, I realized something that would change everything. I wasn't going to die tonight. And neither was my daughter. Vincent had made his choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. The house fell into an eerie silence broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The same clock Vincent's mother had given us as a wedding gift, a symbol of the family legacy he was so proud of. Now its rhythmic counting felt like a countdown to something terrible and inevitable. I lay motionless on the cold floor, every muscle in my body screaming in protest while I fought to keep my breathing shallow and even. The substance Vincent had used, whatever it was, had left me weak but not unconscious. My limbs felt like they were filled with sand, heavy and unresponsive, but my mind remained sharp with the kind of clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. Liliana's small body was curled on the floor beside her overturned chair, and I could see the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Relief flooded through me so intensely it was almost painful. She was alive. We were both alive. But for how long? Vincent's voice drifted from the kitchen, and I realized with growing horror that he was on the phone. His tone was calm, almost cheerful, the same voice he used when talking to clients or neighbors. The voice of a man who had everything under control. "Yes, I know it's late," he was saying. "But I wanted to call as soon as possible. There's been a terrible accident." My blood turned to ice. An accident. He was already setting up his story, crafting the narrative that would explain away our deaths. How long had he been planning this? How many nights had I lain beside him in bed, completely unaware that he was plotting our death? My wife and daughter. They were having dinner when they both suddenly collapsed. I think it might have been food poisoning or maybe a gas leak. I've already called 911, but... His voice broke with perfectly manufactured grief. "I don't think they're going to make it." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't been lying on the floor, slowly dying from whatever he'd fed us, I might have believed it myself. Vincent had always been a gifted liar. It was one of the qualities that had made him so successful in business and so dangerous as a husband. I heard him hang up the phone and begin moving around the kitchen. Cabinets opened and closed. Water ran in the sink. He was cleaning up, destroying evidence, preparing for the arrival of the emergency responders he claimed to have called but almost certainly hadn't. The sound of his footsteps grew closer, and I forced myself to go completely limp as he re-entered the dining room. Through my barely open eyelids, I watched him kneel beside Liliana first, checking her pulse with the clinical detachment of someone examining a broken appliance. "Poor little thing," he murmured, and the false sympathy in his voice made me want to scream. "You never should have gotten in the way." In the way of what? The question burned in my mind, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too deeply. Vincent moved to my side next, his fingers pressing against my neck to check my pulse. His touch was cold, impersonal, nothing like the hands that had once caressed my face with what I'd believed was love. "You know, Rebecca," he said quietly, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "I actually thought about just leaving you, taking Liliana and disappearing. But you've seen too much, know too much. And Liliana, well, she's starting to ask questions about why mommy cries so much." The casual way he spoke about taking the life of his own daughter sent rage coursing through my veins like liquid fire. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't just about the years of abuse, the systematic destruction of my self-worth, the careful isolation from friends and family. This was about Liliana. Innocent, trusting Liliana who still believed her father was a hero. Vincent stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer outside. "Besides," he continued, his voice carrying across the room with chilling clarity, "the life insurance policies are quite substantial. Enough to start over somewhere new. Maybe find someone who appreciates what I have to offer." Life insurance. Of course. The policies he'd insisted we increase just 6 months ago, claiming it was for Liliana's future security. The papers I'd signed without question because I'd trusted him, because despite everything, some part of me had still believed he loved us. "The best part," Vincent said, turning back toward our motionless forms, "is that everyone will see this as a tragedy. Poor Vincent Landon, losing his beautiful wife and daughter in such a senseless accident. The whole community will rally around me. I'll be the grieving widower, the devoted father destroyed by loss." He moved closer again. "You never understood, did you, Rebecca?" His voice had taken on an almost conversational tone, as if he were discussing the weather. You thought this was about anger, about control. But it was never personal. You were just convenient. A means to an end. The words hit me like physical blows, but they also crystallized something inside me. This wasn't the passionate crime of an abusive husband pushed too far. This was calculated, premeditated cruelty. Vincent hadn't snapped, he'd planned this probably for months. I heard him walk back toward the kitchen, and in the silence that followed, I carefully turned my head toward Liliana. Her eyes were closed, but I could see the slight flutter of her eyelashes that told me she was fighting the same battle I was. Conscious but unable to move, aware but helpless. Moving my lips as little as possible, I whispered again, "Stay still, baby. Mommy's here." The faintest pressure of her small fingers against mine told me she'd heard. We were in this together now, my daughter and I, bound by a shared understanding of the monster we'd been living with. Vincent's voice drifted from the kitchen again, and I realized he was making another call. This time his tone was different. More intimate, more familiar. "It's done," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "They'll both be gone within the hour. We can finally be together." The word hit me like a sledgehammer. There was someone else. Someone who knew about his plan, someone who was waiting for us to die so they could step into our lives. "I know, darling," Vincent continued, his voice soft with an affection I hadn't heard in years. "I know it's been hard pretending not to care. But after tonight we won't have to hide anymore. The house, the money, Liliana's college fund, it'll all be ours." Liliana's college fund. The account I'd been contributing to since before she was born, adding money from my part-time job at the library even when Vincent claimed we couldn't afford it. The future I'd been building for my daughter, now being casually divided up between her father and his accomplice. "The funeral will be beautiful," Vincent was saying. "Closed casket, of course, given the circumstances. And you'll be there to comfort me just like we planned. The grieving family friend who helps me through my darkest hour." Family friend. Someone we knew. Someone who had been in our home, who had smiled at me and played with Liliana while secretly planning our deaths. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I forgot to control my breathing. Vincent's voice stopped mid-sentence, and I heard his footsteps moving quickly back toward the dining room. My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to go completely limp, to let my face relax into the slack expression of unconsciousness. "I thought I heard something," he said into the phone, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Let me check on them." His shoes clicked against the hardwood as he approached, and I felt his presence looming over me like a dark cloud. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then I felt his fingers against my neck again, checking my pulse, and I had to fight every instinct in my body not to recoil from his touch. "False alarm," he said finally, moving back toward the kitchen. "They're both out cold. Won't be long now." "I love you too," he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "After 7 years of watching you pretend to be her friend, of seeing you smile and nod while she played the perfect little housewife. Yes, I know how hard it's been. But it's almost over." Her friend. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place with sickening clarity. Someone who had been close to us, close enough to know our routines, our habits, our vulnerabilities. Someone who had watched Vincent abuse me and said nothing, who had smiled at Liliana while planning her death. "The timing has to be perfect," Vincent was saying. "You need to wait at least 2 hours after I call 911 before you show up. Can't have anyone thinking it's suspicious that you arrived so quickly. And remember, you're devastated. You've lost your best friend and her precious daughter." Best friend. The words hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I knew. The voice on the other end of that phone belonged to someone I trusted. Someone I'd confided in, someone who knew every detail of my marriage because I'd been foolish enough to believe she cared. Vincent's laughter drifted from the kitchen, low and satisfied. Oh, she suspected nothing. Right up until the end she was still making excuses for me, still believing I could change. Even tonight, when she tasted the bitter almonds, I could see her trying to convince herself it was her imagination. Bitter almonds. The taste that had triggered my realization, the flavor that didn't belong in chicken marsala. But it wasn't what I'd initially feared. Not cyanide, which would have been quick and merciful. This was something else, something designed to incapacitate rather than immediately eliminate. "The beauty of it," Vincent continued, "is that by the time anyone finds us, It'll look like a tragic accident they caused themselves. Poor Rebecca, driven to desperation by years of imaginary abuse, finally snapped and take her life and that of her daughter. The note I planted in her handwriting is quite convincing. All about how she couldn't take the pain anymore, how she couldn't bear to leave Liliana alone with such a terrible father. A forged suicide note. Of course. Vincent had thought of everything, planned every detail with the methodical precision that had made him successful in business. But he'd made one crucial error. He'd assumed we would be unconscious by now, unable to hear his confessions, unable to understand the true scope of his betrayal. I should go, he said into the phone. Need to stage the scene properly before I make the call. See you soon, darling. Try to look appropriately grief-stricken. The line went dead and I heard Vincent moving around the house with purposeful efficiency. Drawers opened and closed. Papers rustled. He was setting the stage for our deaths, arranging the evidence that would support his carefully crafted narrative. In the silence, I became aware of other sounds. The distant hum of traffic on the main road, the neighbor's dog barking, the ordinary sounds of a world that continued to exist while my daughter and I lay dying on our dining room floor. How many times had I heard these same sounds while Vincent raged at me, while he systematically destroyed my sense of self-worth? How many nights had I lain awake listening to the normal world outside while living in my own private hell? But tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness to my own planned demise, armed with knowledge that could destroy the man who had spent years destroying me. Vincent's footsteps returned to the dining room, and I felt him moving around us, positioning our bodies, arranging the scene. His touch was clinical, impersonal, like a director positioning actors on a stage. When he lifted Liliana's small form and placed her in my arms, arranging us in what was probably meant to look like a final embrace, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming. Perfect, he murmured to himself. Mother and daughter together at the end. Very touching. He stepped back to admire his work and I could feel his satisfaction radiating through the room like heat from a fire. This was his masterpiece, the culmination of years of careful planning and manipulation. In his mind he had already won. But Vincent had forgotten something crucial about the woman he'd married. Beneath the bruises and the fear, beneath the carefully constructed facade of the perfect wife, I was still the girl who had clawed her way out of poverty and abuse once before. I was still the woman who had built a life from nothing, who had survived my own childhood trauma and emerged stronger. And now, as I lay in my daughter's arms with whatever substance he'd used slowly wearing off, I began to plan. Not an escape, it was too late for that. Not a plea for mercy, Vincent was beyond such appeals. But something else entirely. Something that would ensure he paid for every bruise, every tear, every moment of terror he had inflicted on us. Vincent walked to the kitchen one more time and I heard him dialing 911. His voice, when the operator answered, was perfect. Panicked, desperate, the sound of a man who had just discovered his family's bodies. Please, you have to help me, he sobbed into the phone. My wife and daughter. I came home from work and found them like this. I think they're dead. Please send someone quickly. The performance was flawless, worthy of an Academy Award. But as I listened to him lie to the emergency operator, as I felt Liliana's small body trembling against mine, something cold and hard crystallized in my chest. The sound of sirens in the distance should have brought relief, but instead, it filled me with a different kind of dread. Vincent's plan was moving forward exactly as he'd orchestrated it. Soon, paramedics would arrive to find what appeared to be a tragic suicide. The grieving husband would be comforted by friends and neighbors, including the woman who had helped plan our deaths. But the substance Vincent had used, whatever it was beginning to lose its grip on my system. Feeling was slowly returning to my extremities, and I could sense Liliana's breathing becoming stronger and more regular. We were both fighting our way back from the edge of whatever abyss he'd tried to push us into. Vincent paced the living room, his phone pressed to his ear as he continued his performance for the 911 operator. I don't know what happened, he was saying, his voice breaking with manufactured grief. They were fine when I left for work this morning. Rebecca seemed a little stressed lately, but I never thought, oh God, I never thought she would hurt Liliana. Even now, even as he believed we were dying, he was poisoning my memory, ensuring that everyone would remember me as an unstable woman who had taken the life of her own child. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. The sirens grew louder, and I knew we had only minutes before the house would be flooded with emergency responders. Vincent would play his part perfectly. The devastated husband, the loving father destroyed by an unthinkable tragedy. And without evidence to the contrary, who would question his story? But I had heard everything. Every word of his phone conversations, every detail of his plan, every casual admission of guilt. The question was, how could I use that knowledge when I was supposed to be dead? Liliana's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against mine, and I realized she was more aware than she appeared. My brilliant, brave little girl was fighting the same battle I was, clawing her way back to consciousness through sheer force of will. The sirens stopped outside our house and I heard car doors slamming, urgent voices calling out instructions. Vincent's footsteps moved toward the front door, and I heard him unlock it with shaking hands. "In here," he called out, his voice raw with emotion. "Please hurry. I think they're gone." Heavy boots thundered across our hardwood floors as the paramedics rushed into the dining room. I felt hands on my neck checking for a pulse and had to fight every instinct to respond to their touch. "We've got 2 females, adult and child," a woman's voice called out. "Both unconscious but breathing. Pulses weak but steady." "Sir, I need you to step back," a man's voice said, presumably to Vincent. "Can you tell us what happened here?" Vincent's response was a masterclass in manipulation. His voice shook with just the right amount of grief and confusion as he spun his tale of coming home to find us collapsed, of his desperate attempts to revive us, of his growing fear that Rebecca had finally succumbed to the depression that had been plaguing her for months. "She's been struggling," he said, and I could hear him moving closer. "The stress of being a mother, the isolation. I tried to get her help but she refused. She said she was fine, that she could handle it. I should have done more. I should have seen the signs." The lies flowed from his lips like water, each one carefully crafted to support his narrative. He painted a picture of a troubled woman on the edge of a breakdown, a devoted husband who had tried everything to save his family. It was a story that would resonate with everyone who heard it, a tragedy that would generate sympathy and support for the grieving widower. "We need to get them to the hospital immediately," the female paramedic said. "This looks like they were targeted through their meal. Do you know if your wife had access to any toxic substances?" She's been cleaning obsessively lately," Vincent replied, his voice heavy with implication. "Always worried about germs, about keeping Liliana safe. There are cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink and she's been using them constantly." Another lie, another piece of evidence planted to support his story. I wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, but my body still wouldn't respond to my commands. I could only lie there and listen as Vincent systematically destroyed my reputation with every word. I felt myself being lifted onto a stretcher, Liliana placed on another beside me. The paramedics worked with efficient urgency, checking our vital signs, starting 4 lines, preparing us for transport. Through it all, Vincent maintained his performance, the picture of a man destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. "I'll follow you to the hospital," he told the paramedics, his voice breaking. "Please do everything you can. They're all I have." The irony was almost unbearable. The man who had just tried to eliminate us was now playing the role of the devoted family man, desperate to save the lives he had just attempted to end. And everyone believed him. Why wouldn't they? Vincent Landon was a pillar of the community, a successful businessman with no history of violence or instability. As they wheeled us toward the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of our neighbors gathered on their front porches, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Jeremy from next door had her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and we were racing through the night toward Mercy General Hospital. The paramedics continued their work, monitoring our vital signs, radioing ahead to the emergency room. I could feel Liliana's stretcher beside mine. "Vitals are stabilizing," the female paramedic reported. "Whatever they ingested, it doesn't appear to be immediately fatal. We might have gotten to them in time. If only she knew how close Vincent had come to succeeding. If the substance he'd used had been just a little stronger, if we'd consumed just a little more, if he'd waited just a little longer to call for help, we would have been beyond saving. But we weren't. We were alive, aware, and armed with the knowledge of exactly what Vincent had done and why. The question now was how to use that knowledge to ensure he paid for his crimes. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital's emergency bay, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be Vincent's victim anymore. I wasn't going to let him walk away from this with his reputation intact and his pockets full of insurance money. I wasn't going to let him start a new life with the woman who had helped him plan our deaths. Vincent Landon thought he had committed the perfect crime. He was about to discover that there's no such thing as perfect when you're dealing with a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The emergency room at Mercy General was a symphony of controlled chaos. Monitors beeping, nurses calling out medical jargon, the squeak of wheels on linoleum as gurneys rushed past. But for me, lying on that hospital bed with tubes and wires attached to my body, the world had narrowed to a single burning focus: survival and revenge. Dr. Amina Reeves, the attending physician, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands. She'd been working on Liliana and me for the past hours, running blood tests, monitoring our vital signs, trying to determine exactly what Vincent had used on us. "The good news," she told Vincent, who had positioned himself at my bedside like the perfect concerned husband, "is that whatever they ingested doesn't appear to be immediately life-threatening. Their vital signs are stabilizing and the blood work should tell us more." Vincent's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with my limp ones in a gesture that would have looked tender to anyone watching. But I could feel the tension in his grip, the barely controlled anxiety as he waited to see if his plan would still succeed. "Will they be okay?" he asked, his voice thick with false emotion. "I can't lose them, doctor. They're everything to me. We're doing everything we can, Mr. Landon. The next few hours will be critical." Critical. Vincent's grip on my hand tightened almost imperceptibly. He was calculating, weighing his options. If we died now in the hospital, it would still support his story. A tragic case discovered too late, despite his heroic efforts to save us. But I wasn't going to die. Not tonight. Not ever if I could help it. The substance Vincent had used was wearing off more quickly than he'd anticipated. I could feel strength returning to my limbs, could sense my body fighting off whatever he'd fed us. Liliana, in the bed beside mine, was showing similar signs of recovery. Her breathing had deepened and I'd caught the flutter of her eyelashes when the nurses weren't looking. "I need to make some calls," Vincent said, releasing my hand. "Let people know what's happened. Rebecca's sister in Portland, my mother in Florida." More lies. My sister lived in Seattle, not Portland, and Vincent's mother had been dead for 3 years. But he was establishing his alibi, creating a paper trail of the devoted husband reaching out to family in his time of crisis. "Of course," Dr. Reeves said. "There's a family waiting area down the hall. Take all the time you need." As Vincent's footsteps faded down the corridor, I allowed myself to open my eyes just a fraction. The room was dimly lit, with only the glow from the monitors providing illumination. Liliana was in the bed next to mine, her small form dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her. "Liliana," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, meeting mine with a clarity that took my breath away. My 5-year-old daughter, who should have been traumatized and confused, looked at me with an understanding far beyond her years. "Daddy tried to hurt us," she whispered back, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. Liliana had understood what was happening, had been aware during Vincent's phone conversations, had heard his casual discussion of our deaths. My baby girl had been forced to confront the true nature of the man she'd called Daddy, and the knowledge was written in her eyes like a scar. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, fighting back tears. "But we're safe now. And Mommy is going to make sure he can never hurt us again." "Promise?" she asked, and the trust in her voice nearly broke my heart. "I promise." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us both close our eyes again, resuming our pretense of unconsciousness. But it wasn't Vincent returning. It was a woman's voice I recognized with a shock that nearly made me gasp aloud. "Excuse me, I'm looking for the Landon family? I heard about the accident. Melissa Cohen. My best friend for the past years. The woman who had held me while I cried about Vincent's latest episode. The woman who had babysat Liliana countless times, who had been like an aunt to my daughter. Are you family?" Dr. Reeves asked. "Rebecca's best friend," Melissa replied, her voice perfectly pitched with concern and grief. "I came as soon as I heard. How are they?" The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Vincent had ever inflicted. Melissa had been my lifeline, the one person I'd trusted with the truth about my marriage. She'd encouraged me to document Vincent's abuse, had helped me research divorce lawyers, had promised to testify on my behalf if I ever found the courage to leave. All while planning to take my life with my husband. "They're stable for now," Dr. Reeves said. "Mr. Landon is making some calls. I'm sure he'll be glad to see you." "Thank you. This is just so shocking." Rebecca seemed fine when I saw her yesterday. A little stressed, but... Another lie. I hadn't seen Melissa in over a week. Not since she'd cancelled our coffee date at the last minute, claiming a work emergency. Now I understood why. She'd been busy planning the last steps in her plan to get rid of us. Vincent's voice echoed down the hallway as he returned, and I heard the moment he spotted Melissa. "Oh, thank God you're here," he said, his voice breaking with relief. "I don't know what I'm going to do if I lose them." "Vincent, I'm so sorry," Melissa replied, and I could picture her embracing him, offering comfort to the man who had just tried to eliminate his family. "What happened?" "I don't know," Vincent said, his voice muffled as if his face was buried in her shoulder. "I came home and found them collapsed in the dining room. The doctors think it might be some kind of poisoning, but Rebecca would never. She loves Liliana too much to." He let the implication hang in the air, painting me once again as an unstable woman who had harmed her own child. Melissa made appropriate sounds of shock and disbelief, playing her part in their twisted drama. "The police will want to talk to you," Dr. Reeves said quietly. "In cases like this, it's standard procedure." "Of course," Vincent replied. "I'll do whatever I can to help. I just want to understand what happened to my family." "Police." The word sent a chill through me, but also a spark of hope. If I could find a way to tell them the truth, to expose Vincent's plan before it was too late. "I should call Rebecca's work," Melissa said. "Let them know she won't be in tomorrow. And Liliana's school." "That's very thoughtful," Vincent replied. "I don't know what I'd do without you right now." The casual intimacy in their voices made my stomach turn. How long had this been going on? How many times had Melissa sat in my living room, drinking my coffee and listening to me pour out my heart about my failing marriage, all while carrying on an affair with my husband? "Why don't you go get some coffee?" Melissa suggested. "You look exhausted." "I'll sit with them for a while." "I don't want to leave them," Vincent protested, but I could hear the relief in his voice. He needed a break from his performance, needed time to regroup and plan his next moves. "Just for a few minutes," Melissa insisted. "I'll call you if anything changes." Vincent's footsteps faded down the corridor, and I felt Melissa's presence beside my bed. For a moment there was only silence, broken by the steady beeping of the monitors. Then she spoke, her voice so low I almost missed it. "I know you can hear me, Rebecca." My blood turned to ice, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. "Vincent told me about the dosage," she continued, her voice conversational, almost friendly. "Just enough to incapacitate, not enough to destroy immediately. He wanted you to suffer, to know what was happening. He's always been cruel that way." The casual admission of guilt, the complete lack of remorse in her voice, was more chilling than anything Vincent had said. At least he had the excuse of being a sociopath. Melissa had been my friend, had claimed to love Liliana like her own niece. "You know, I almost felt bad about it," she said, and I could hear her settling into the chair beside my bed. "You were so trusting, so naive. Even after everything Vincent put you through, you still believed in the goodness of people. It was almost endearing." She paused and I felt her lean closer. "But you were in the way, Rebecca. Vincent and I have been planning this for over a year. The life insurance, the new identities, the house in Costa Rica where no one will ever find us. You and Liliana were just obstacles to be removed. A year. They had been planning our deaths for a year while I'd been trying to save my marriage, while I'd been protecting Liliana from the truth about her father, while I'd been confiding in the woman who was plotting to kill us. The beautiful thing is," Melissa continued, "everyone will remember you exactly the way we want them to. The unstable wife who couldn't handle the pressure. The mother who snapped and tried to take her daughter with her. Vincent will be the tragic hero, the man who tried so hard to save his family but couldn't overcome his wife's mental illness." She stood up, and I felt her hand brush against my forehead in a mockery of affection. "Goodbye, Rebecca. I'd say I'm sorry, but we both know that would be a lie." Her footsteps moved toward Liliana's bed and every muscle in my body tensed. If she tried to hurt my daughter, if she so much as touched her. And goodbye to you too, little Liliana, Melissa whispered. You really are a sweet child. It's a shame you had to be part of this, but Vincent was right. You were starting to ask too many questions. Children see too much, remember too much. It's better this way. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped like a rubber band stretched too far, releasing all its stored energy at once. The fear that had controlled me for years, the doubt that had made me question my own perceptions, the guilt that had kept me trapped in an abusive marriage. All of it disappeared in an instant, replaced by something cold and hard and absolutely certain. I opened my eyes. Melissa jerked back in surprise, her hand flying to her chest. For a moment we stared at each other across the dim hospital room. The woman who had betrayed me and the woman who was about to destroy her. Hello, Melissa, I said, my voice steady and clear. We need to talk. The color drained from Melissa's face as she realized her mistake. In her arrogance, in her certainty that Vincent's plan had worked perfectly, she had revealed everything. Every detail of their conspiracy, every cruel calculation, every moment of betrayal. All of it recorded in my memory with crystal clarity. Rebecca, she stammered, taking a step back from my bed. You're awake. I should call the doctor. Sit down, I said quietly, and something in my voice made her freeze. We're going to have a conversation, you and I. And you're going to listen very carefully to what I have to say. Melissa's eyes darted toward the door, calculating her chances of escape. But I was already reaching for the call button, my finger hovering over the red emergency alert that would bring nurses running. One word from me, I said, and this room will be full of medical staff. I'll tell them exactly what I heard tonight. Every phone call, every confession, every detail of your plan to take my life and that of my daughter. How do you think that will go for you? She sank into the chair beside my bed, her face pale and drawn. The confident woman who had just been gloating over my supposed death was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. Vincent said you'd be unconscious for hours. The dosage was calculated. Vincent made an error, I interrupted. He underestimated me. Just like he's been doing for 7 years. Liliana stirred in the bed beside me and I saw her eyes flutter open. My brave little girl had been listening too, had heard every word of Melissa's confession. The knowledge in her young eyes was heartbreaking, but there was something else there too. A strength that reminded me of myself at her age when I'd first learned that the adults in my life couldn't always be trusted. Mommy, Liliana whispered, her voice small but clear. I'm here, sweetheart, I said, never taking my eyes off Melissa. Everything's going to be okay now. Melissa looked between us with growing panic. You can't prove anything, she said desperately. It's your word against ours. Who's going to believe that Vincent tried to destroy his own family? He's a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. And you're his accomplice, I said calmly. His lover. His partner trying to end our lives. Tell me, Melissa, how long have you been sleeping with my husband? The question hit her like a physical blow. It's not what you think. 2 years, I said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. It started 2 years ago, didn't it? Right around the time Vincent's behavior changed, when he became more calculating, more patient. When he stopped hitting me in places where the bruises would show. Melissa's silence was confirmation enough. You taught him that, I continued. You helped him become a better abuser, a more careful predator. You probably told him that the obvious violence was too risky, that he needed to be smarter about it. You don't know what you're talking about, Melissa said, but her voice lacked conviction. I know that you've been in my house dozens of times, studying our routines, learning our habits. I know that you encouraged me to increase our life insurance policies, claiming it was for Liliana's future security. I know that you've been documenting my supposed mental health issues, building a case for my instability. Each accusation hit its mark, and I could see Melissa crumbling under the weight of her exposed lies. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. I also know, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, that you made one crucial mistake tonight. You assumed I was helpless, that I would die quietly and conveniently, leaving Vincent free to start his new life with you. But I'm not dead, Melissa. I'm very much alive. And I remember everything. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us both turn toward the door. Vincent was returning, probably with coffee and a renewed commitment to his grieving husband performance. But he was about to walk into a very different scene than the one he'd left. "Liliana," I said quietly, "I need you to pretend to be asleep again. Can you do that for Mommy?" My daughter nodded and closed her eyes, but I could see the tension in her small body. She was ready to fight just like her mother. Vincent appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of carefully crafted sorrow. "Any change?" he asked Melissa, his voice heavy with false hope. "Actually, yes," I said, sitting up in bed and meeting his eyes directly. "There's been a very significant change." Vincent's coffee cups hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the room like gunshots. Hot liquid splashed across the linoleum as he stared at me in shock, his carefully constructed facade cracking like ice in the sun. "Rebecca," he breathed, and for the first time in years, I heard genuine fear in his voice. "You're awake. Thank God, I was so worried." "Cut the act, Vincent," I said, my voice cutting through his lies like a blade. "I heard everything. Every phone call, every confession, every detail of your plan to destroy Liliana and me." The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally, a cold rage that I recognized all too well. This was the real Vincent Landon, the man behind the mask, the predator who had been stalking his own family for years. "You're confused," he said finally, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he was trying to gaslight me. "Something toxic is in your system, Rebecca. You're not thinking clearly. You're imagining things." "Am I imagining Melissa's confession?" I asked. "Am I imagining your phone calls to your accomplice? Am I imagining the life insurance policies, the forged suicide note, the plan to start a new life in Costa Rica?" Vincent's eyes flicked to Melissa, who was sitting frozen in her chair like a deer caught in headlights. I could see him calculating, trying to determine how much I actually knew, how much damage had been done to his carefully laid plans. "I don't know what you think you heard," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You've been unconscious for hours. You're confused, disoriented." "I've been conscious the entire time," I said, and watched his face go white. "I heard you call your lover. I heard you discuss our life insurance policies. I heard you plan our funeral. I heard you celebrate our deaths while we were lying on our dining room floor." Vincent took a step toward my bed and I saw his hands clench into fists. For a moment the mask slipped completely and I saw the monster underneath, the man who had terrorized me for years. "You can't prove anything," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's your word against mine. And who's going to believe the unstable wife who tried to take her life and her daughter?" "The police will," I said calmly. "Especially when they test the dinner you prepared tonight. Especially when they find the forged suicide note you planted. Especially when they investigate your relationship with Melissa and discover your plans to flee the country." Vincent's composure finally shattered completely. "You stupid bastard," he snarled, lunging toward my bed. "You should have just died quietly like you were supposed to." He never finished the sentence. The door burst open as Dr. Reeves and 2 security guards rushed into the room, drawn by the sound of breaking coffee cups and raised voices. They found Vincent standing over my bed with his hands raised, his face twisted with rage, while Melissa cowered in her chair and I sat calmly in bed with my finger on the emergency call button. "Mr. Landon, step away from the bed," one of the security guards ordered, his hand moving to the radio on his belt. "This is a misunderstanding," Vincent said, his voice immediately shifting back to its false calm. "My wife is confused, disoriented from the poisoning. She's not thinking clearly." "Actually," I said, looking directly at Dr. Reeves, "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. And I need to speak to the police immediately. My husband just attempted to unalive me and my daughter, and I have evidence to prove it." The room erupted into controlled chaos as Dr. Reeves called for additional security and contacted the police. Vincent continued to protest his innocence, but I could see the desperation in his eyes as his carefully constructed world began to collapse around him. Melissa tried to slip out during the confusion, but I called out to the security guards. "Don't let her leave," I said. "She's his accomplice. She helped plan everything." As the guards moved to block the door, I saw Liliana's body moving. My daughter was awake now, watching the scene unfold with the same calm determination I felt in my own heart. "Is it over, Mommy?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, squeezing her hand gently. It's over. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The legal battle was just beginning. There would be investigations, trials, testimony. Vincent and Melissa would fight the charges, would try to discredit my story, would attempt to paint me as an unstable woman seeking revenge against her innocent husband. But they had made one fatal error. They had underestimated the woman they thought they had broken. They had forgotten that beneath the bruises and the fear, beneath the carefully constructed facade of the perfect wife, lived someone who had survived worse than anything they could inflict. And now, as I watched Vincent being led away in handcuffs while Melissa was read her rights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that justice would be served. The game was over. And for the first time in 7 years I had won. The courtroom was packed on the day of Vincent's sentencing. I sat in the front row with Liliana beside me, her small hand clasped tightly in mine as we waited for the judge to deliver his verdict. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of investigations, depositions, and legal proceedings, but through it all, the truth had remained constant and unshakable. The evidence had been overwhelming. The toxicology reports confirmed that Vincent had used a rare sedative in our dinner, something he'd obtained through his connections in the pharmaceutical industry. The forged suicide note was discovered exactly where I'd told police to look, written in a crude imitation of my handwriting. Most damning of all were the financial records that revealed Vincent and Melissa's elaborate escape plan. Fake passports, offshore accounts, and a house in Costa Rica purchased under assumed names. Judge Amina Williams was a stern woman in her 60s who had presided over domestic violence cases for over 20 years. She had listened to every piece of testimony with careful attention, her expression growing more grave as the full scope of Vincent's crimes became clear. "Vincent Landon," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "you have been found guilty of attempted homicide in the first degree, and conspiracy to inflict deadly harm, insurance fraud, and domestic violence. These crimes represent not just a betrayal of your family, but a calculated attempt to destroy the lives of those who trusted you most." Vincent sat at the defendant's table in his expensive suit, his lawyer beside him. Even now, even after everything, he maintained his innocence. During the trial, he had painted me as an unstable woman seeking revenge, had claimed that Melissa was just a friend offering comfort during a difficult time. But the jury had seen through his lies, had recognized the monster beneath the charming facade. "The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole," Judge Williams continued. "Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution for medical expenses and emotional damages to your victims." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Vincent's shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation finally hit him. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his dreams of a new life with Melissa reduced to ashes. Melissa had been sentenced 3 months earlier. Her cooperation with prosecutors had earned her a reduced sentence of 25 years, but she would still be an old woman by the time she was released. The friendship we had shared, the trust one had placed in her, had been revealed as nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to destroy me. As the bailiffs led Vincent away, he turned to look at me one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Even now, he saw himself as the victim, the man whose perfect plan had been ruined by an ungrateful wife who refused to die quietly. I met his gaze steadily, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction. The woman he had tried to break, the victim he had underestimated, had been the architect of his downfall. Every bruise he had given me, every tear he had caused, every moment of terror he had inflicted, all of it had led to this moment of absolute justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their cameras and microphones, eager for a statement from the woman who had survived her own murder. But I had nothing to say to them. My story wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about survival, about protecting my daughter, about refusing to let evil triumph over innocence. Liliana and I walked to our car in silence, leaving the circus of media attention behind. We had a new life to build now, free from the shadow of Vincent's violence. The house where he had tried to eliminate us had been sold, the proceeds going toward Liliana's college fund, the same fund he had planned to steal. We lived in a small apartment across town now, modest but safe, filled with laughter instead of fear. "Mommy," Liliana said as I buckled her into her car seat, "are you sad that Daddy is going to jail?" It was a question she had asked several times over the past months, and each time I struggled to find an age-appropriate answer. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her father had tried to take her life? How do you help a child understand that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need protection from? I'm sad that Daddy made bad choices, I said finally. But I'm not sad that we're safe now. And I'm not sad that he can't hurt anyone else. Liliana nodded solemnly, processing this with the remarkable resilience that children possess. She had been through trauma that would have broken many adults, but she was healing, growing stronger every day. We both were. As I drove home through the familiar streets of our town, I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago. Broken, terrified, convinced that I was trapped in a life I couldn't escape. That woman had believed she was powerless, had accepted Vincent's version of reality where she was weak and worthless and deserving of punishment. But that woman had been wrong. She had possessed a strength she didn't know existed, a fierce protective instinct that had saved both our lives. When faced with the ultimate test, when her daughter's life hung in the balance, she had found the courage to fight back. The apartment we now called home was small but bright, filled with Liliana's artwork and the books I had started reading again. I had returned to work at the library where my colleagues welcomed me back with understanding and support. Slowly, carefully, I was rebuilding the life that Vincent had tried to destroy. That evening, as I tucked Liliana into bed, she looked up at me with those serious green eyes that saw far too much for someone so young. "Mommy," she said, "will you tell me the story about the brave princess again?" It was a story I had created for her during those first difficult weeks after Vincent's arrest, when nightmares plagued her sleep and she struggled to understand what had happened to our family. In the story, a princess and her daughter were trapped in a dark castle by an evil sorcerer who pretended to love them but really wanted to hurt them. But the princess was cleverer than the sorcerer realized, and when he tried to cast a spell to make them disappear forever, she turned his own magic against him and saved them both. "Once upon a time," I began, settling beside her on the bed, "there was a princess who seemed ordinary to everyone who knew her. But inside she had a power that even she didn't know existed." As I told the familiar story, I watched Liliana's eyes grow heavy with sleep. She was safe now, truly safe in a way she had never been before. The monster who had threatened her was locked away forever, unable to hurt her or anyone else. When she finally drifted off to sleep, I sat in the darkness of her room for a long time, listening to her peaceful breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build the life we deserved. There would be therapy sessions to help us both heal from our trauma, legal proceedings to finalize our financial security, and the ongoing work of creating a future free from fear. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of our small apartment, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace of a lull between storms, but the deep, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you have faced your worst nightmare and emerged victorious. Vincent Landon had tried to write the ending to our story. He had planned our deaths with meticulous care, had orchestrated what he believed would be the perfect crime. But he had forgotten one crucial detail: the story wasn't his to tell. It was mine. And I had written an ending he never saw coming. As I turned off the light and headed to my own room, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had collapsed on her dining room floor 6 months ago. This woman stood straighter, smiled more easily, looked at the world with clear eyes unclouded by fear. This woman was a survivor. And more than that, she was free. The taste of almonds would always remind me of that terrible night, but it would also remind me of something else. The moment I discovered that I was stronger than I ever imagined, braver than I ever believed, and more determined to protect my daughter than any force that tried to destroy us. Vincent had wanted to erase us from existence, to reduce us to nothing more than tragic footnotes in his carefully constructed new life. Instead, he had given us something far more valuable than he could ever understand: the absolute certainty that we could survive anything, overcome any obstacle, and build a future worthy of the love we shared. In the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. Not his imprisonment, not his public humiliation, not the destruction of his reputation and dreams. The greatest revenge was our happiness, our healing, our refusal to let his darkness define our light. We had won. Not just the legal battle, not just the fight for justice, but the war for our souls. And as I drifted off to sleep in my own bed, in my own home, surrounded by the peace I had fought so hard to claim, I knew with absolute certainty that we would never be victims again. We were survivors. We were free. And we were finally truly home.